I'm Coral. I am 68 years old.
My name is Clara. I am 43 years old.
I'm Amy. I am 46.
My name is Jamie. I'm 41.
Hi, I'm Erin. I'm 45 years old.
Hi, my name is Katie. I am 52 years old.
I'm Angela. I'm 45.
I'm Nicole. I am 45.
Welcome back to Interwovxn's third season, featuring conversations centered on care and on celebrating and supporting women in middle life. We're thrilled this season to exchange support with In Context Inc., Not Your Mother's digital marketing agency. From customized websites to SEO, they work with you at your pace, within your budget, and ensure that you feel seen and heard at all times. Visit incontextseo.com/interwoven to learn more. Today's episode features a special conversation between two friends who are also professional therapists. Kristin and Brittany talk about what led them to their profession, how to start the therapy process, choosing the therapist that's right for you, boundary setting, self-care, and doing something for future you. A huge thank you to this month's featured musicians, Janet Ransdell and Susie Muehlbauer, for their contributions. Remember to hit subscribe so you can be the first to know about new episodes, and visit our website so that you can sign up for our newsletter, register for community events, and access all of our resources. Find us at interwoven.com. That's interwovxn.com.
My name is Kristin Belkofer. I am turning 40 in a few weeks. I am a parent to two children. One is 20 and one is almost 6 years old. She'll be turning 6 right about the time I'm turning 40. I raised these kids with my husband, who also is in the mental health world. So that makes for some interesting sort of richness to our life, but a lot of challenges that also come along with the boundaries and containment of our work worlds, right? I'm the founder of Clara Healing Institute. We are a multifaceted, holistic mental health practice that's located in Wauwatosa. I think my passion right now is working with anyone who's looking to grow or expand their sense of worth and value and agency and ultimately leadership, especially women's leadership, in whatever context that means. So I know we often think about that from like a business perspective or maybe even a political or societal perspective. But I think just from the perspective of being a therapist, it's often, helping women needing some support in developing their leadership in their own advocacy, leadership in their household, leadership in developing their identity, especially after a life transition of some sorts, their career potentially, their community. I'll turn it over to you, Brittany.
My name is Brittany Rennes, and I am 36. I am a diehard Sagittarius. Kristin and I were chatting about that before we hopped on today. So in classic form, I am a seeker of knowledge, a lifetime learner. I have many, many hobbies, things that I'm interested in. So I'm both a board certified art therapist as well as a licensed professional counselor with Clara Healing Institute. So as an art therapist, I'm really rooted in a creative background. So I studied art. I have a background in photography as well as some three-dimensional art practice. And that has certainly evolved over time, and more recently, I've been really interested in learning about using natural dye methods. In addition to practicing here at Clara, I also work with a flower farm throughout their season, which usually is February through November. So shout out to Aromatic Acres. That is the flower farm here in Tosa that I work with. I think that just my hobbies, the things that I'm learning, hands-on experience that I get through all of the things that I'm doing outside of being a therapist really also inform my practice of being a therapist, really empowering people to find the things that they feel passionate about.
All of that is wonderful. We love Brittany's hobbies. They directly impact our quality of life and work here because we get lovely flowers. Yes. And yes, I think clients do really respond to a therapist being a whole person.
Yes.
Who isn't just this sort of blank slate / receptacle that kind of has this one clinical lens. I think it just makes the process a whole lot more comfortable and a whole lot more human.
Absolutely.
And also just on a professional level, as I know I've kind of mentioned to you probably before, I tend to really like therapists who have multiple interests, who have shown that they've kind of been on a path, whether that's lifelong learning, as you mentioned, that's definitely one of our core values here. Actually having been on kind of like a winding life path yourself and not feeling like afraid or ashamed to talk about that. I mean, like, who would want to go see a therapist that's like, here is your manual for living?
Absolutely. I think it really speaks to just having like a relational approach.
Right.
What that really means is just building a relationship, entering into a relationship. The clients that we're working with, we can kind of look at each other on this equal human level and relate to that. It's a very strong foundation of my work and my practice.
I think you're totally right. I mean, I'm very proud and glad that we can access all of this information and have great education resources and continuing education. But at the end of the day, I think the relationship is what provides the space for change to happen. I would imagine that this might be true for you too, just the sheer amount of people that tell us about early therapy experiences or prior therapy experiences that they had where they didn't feel like that relationship was a great fit, or they didn't really feel like heard or seen authentically, or they felt kind of like they were sort of treated as a diagnosis or as like quote unquote presenting problem that they came in with. I think after just like hearing that over and over and over again, and also having my own experience with that, I've had wonderful therapists in my life. I've also had some real not so great experiences that informed my, approach as well.
That is really important for individuals that, are looking to connect with a therapist, is to ensure that, it is a good fit, that it feels like it is a space where you feel comfortable, that you can be yourself, that you can relate, that you can connect. That is the foundation of where the work starts. And also maybe what has shifted in mental health more recently is to allow, clients to participate in building that relationship, as opposed to maybe some more of the traditional clinical spaces where clients are just given a therapist. And there's not really a consideration of that relationship. Encouraging clients to ask questions, initially offering kind of like, those consultations that we do when someone's interested in services, see if this is going to be a good fit.
Some of the questions that we had reflected on about the therapy process, especially for folks who are starting it. And the first question was about how we decided on this profession, or how we came into this profession. What led you to make that choice? So I am interested to hear.
When I reflect on that question, I think my answer has definitely changed over time. I think a lot of my own life experience as I was growing up, my childhood, my background, my family relationships, there was a lot there as a kid and as a teenager, and at the time I didn't really understand that that's what I was doing. It was much later as I started to kind of build some self-awareness about who I am and kind of go through my own journey, healing and kind of learning more about myself and pursuing my graduate education, that I kind of started to make sense of that. And so I kind of feel initially like I fell into it and I was like, okay, this makes sense. It was almost like a calling, right? It was almost like something that I was naturally gravitating towards. I had a really strong background in art, but I also was really interested in learning how to use art to connect with people. Connecting with people on this, really intimate level, I think is a major honor.
Yeah, I fully agree. Even as you were talking about this like idea of like a calling or integrating all those things that you're interested in. Oh, there's like a name.
Yes.
Right.
I was working at a jewelry store selling engagement rings, having like a little bit of a crisis of like, what am I going to do with my life? I was preparing for an art show and I just remember sitting down and like framing these photographs and like I started crying and I was like, what am I going to do? And it was at this point of my life, like really trying to figure things out. And I didn't go to graduate school until later on. And so, I really was like working and had all this life experience, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I feel like the art pushed me a little bit. And then I made some connections with some other people that were interested in art therapy. And I was like, okay, sign me up.
Absolutely. And like you said, like, having that life and work experience, especially as an artist, gives you this interesting professional experience. I remember like being in high school and like as soon as I learned that art school was like a thing that you could do, that's what I'm doing. Kind of started to envision my life being that way and looking that way. And I think like looking back, it helped me just kind of deal with the fear of the unknown. I think I had some pretty limiting beliefs about myself at the time, and like art was always something that came very naturally. And for whatever reason, that felt out route for me. And when I wound up going to art school, I didn't really like it. It took me like a good amount of time to figure out why I didn't really like it that much. Ultimately, it was kind of lonely. And it was like when I actually realized that I'm not maybe quite as introverted as I thought I was, as well as like it was just like a very isolating sort of environment because you went to these classes, which it's very skills based, right? So you come in and you kind of are choosing ultimately like what program you're going to go into. And I was fine art. I remember like the sheer amount of time I'm spending alone in my own brain. It kind of got me thinking about other things. And I also kind of socioeconomic status didn't really feel like I fit in. And there is a pretty pragmatic part of me that was like, what's this going to look like into the future? And I remember talking to somebody there, like another student who I think was also a little bit like having second thoughts. And she mentioned how she has a therapist who's an art therapist. And I was like, that's a thing that people can do. So before all that happened, I also got pregnant with my son, which was what led me to ultimately become an art school dropout and figure out that I need to kind of take some time and figure out what I want to do and how I want to approach that, and also straight up survival. So after I kind of recalibrated a bit, I think I started volunteering at Aurora for their sexual assault advocacy program. Ultimately, it's like if somebody is assaulted and they're seeking medical services or legal services or need to get connected to therapy services, that's sort of what like an advocate does. And then also like kind of seeing how that could fit in with art therapy is like ultimately what led me to do that for my undergrad. And then the rest led in sort of a winding way towards becoming a therapist. I had originally planned on doing an art therapy master's degree as well through a bunch of other life transitions, life and what it looked like to be a mom with a 10-year-old or something at that time. I pivoted to another path. Part of me was really interested in research and program development and policy. And so I kind of veered towards like the community psychology world, which led me to look at both of those spaces, being a therapist and having a practice, but also designing more of like programmatic sort of element to that. So it can be replicated, it can meet the community's needs, so on and so forth. Some of the questions that were posed here that we're chatting about in regards to therapy talks about common topics and triggers that we come across and what are the tools that we recommend specifically with clients who are women and middle life. I thought about this question I took generally. I'm curious if you have thoughts about that.
The first thing that comes to mind that is a reoccurring theme across the board is boundaries.
1,000%.
I cannot stress boundaries
1,000%.
enough.
Yeah.
Learning what boundaries are, learning how to identify boundaries, learning how to establish boundaries, learning how to maintain boundaries.
Learning that it's okay to have them in the first place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Deconstructing a lot of misconceptions about boundaries. Yes. So like, therefore, if you have to say no to something, being mean or someone, you're going to hurt someone's feelings, right? And, really working with, I would say almost all of my clients, 99% of them, it's just this emphasis on boundaries and like, it's okay to have boundaries.
Absolutely.
And it's okay to voice those. And that doesn't mean that you're being mean. And it doesn't mean that you're being a bad person. How boundaries really communicate this level of respect that we have for ourselves and for our relationships.
Absolutely.
And I also think another reoccurring theme within boundaries is that they change. It's not just like a one and done conversation. We might have an initial boundary, and as we continue to go about life, that boundary can start to change a little bit. And like how to communicate that with the people around us. I think that is a lot of time spent in conversations with my clients is how to manage boundaries and how to really empower people to voice their boundaries and figure out what that's going to look like for them.
I completely agree. To speak to this question specifically about clients who are women in midlife, deconstructing this idea, because for many women, this is like the first time they even thought about that. So they're like looking back at their entire first half of life being like, oh my God, I never thought I had boundaries. I never thought I could.
Right.
I thought that if I asserted how I really felt in this situation, I would be abandoned or ridiculed or rejected. And so it's like a bit of like a mind explosion, It may have been you. I think you may have introduced me to the book, Nidra Tawwab. Is that how you say her name? I forgot her middle name. I since bought that that book. And then I have it on my Audible.
Yeah.
When I'm doing boundaries work with clients, I recommend that they listen to it.
Same.
It's different than reading it, where you read that and you think, I could never say that thing in real life if I needed to. And then all of a sudden you hear her essentially kind of give you permission and a script and a guide. And you're like, oh, well, that didn't sound so bad.
Right.
I can say that, so I feel like those tangible tools related to boundaries are very, very helpful.
That is my go-to boundaries resource. Yeah. I think the book is Set Boundaries, Find Peace.
Yeah,
Nidra Tawwab. I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name correctly. Really great resource and a huge recurring theme. I got to stick to my boundaries and what works for me and whatever that's going to look like. But I think that still is like an ongoing lifelong learning process is boundaries and how to communicate those boundaries.
Especially in the construct of women that we're talking about in midlife.
Yeah.
Many of us were not taught to think that way or taught to even have that determined, much less like have those evolve and share those with people. Yeah. So it's really pretty mind-blowing when you can kind of allow somebody's space to figure that out. It's okay. They don't really need anybody else's permission. And I think people feel very, very validated in that.
For women who, they give, and that's been like the precedent, and kind of coming to the realization, it's like, okay, well, I need to take care of myself. Absolutely. And how that shifts our boundaries. It also can shift the way people are responding to us in our lives and be helping them create narratives that fit with the present moment and not so much thinking about that's what you used to do or that's how I used to be or I let this boundary go in the past. Like it's okay to kind of rewrite that narrative, give ourselves permission to do something different.
I think that's a nice transition into some of the other questions, because it made me think about how even sometimes for some of the women that we see reaching out to say that they're looking for help or that they want support beyond their ecosystem in their lives as it is a boundary. Asserting that they need this might be like busting down a lot of preconceived notions that they had about their lives before. I don't know about you, but in my practice, there's a real fair amount of people that come in and they're pinpointed a lot of difficulty, trauma, adversity that's happened in their lives. And there's also a very good amount of people that are like, you know what, my life isn't that bad. I've got all these things that I need. For a long time, I didn't even think I was deserving of therapy. It didn't seem like things were wrong enough until, something was like, okay, I can't live like this anymore. How do you recommend that women find a mental health provider that feels like a good fit? So in other words, how might you recommend that they kind of start that process?
First, reaching out for help is huge. Like I cannot say enough about the amount of bravery and courageous of an act that is. And it's a big deal. If that looks like, doing some research of what options you have available to you in your area, and so whether that's some online research, if that's Googling outpatient therapists in your area, if that's, just hopping onto like the Psychology Today website, which is a really great resource to search for providers, also offers some filters to kind of maybe weed out things that maybe you're not interested or, but I do think that the first step is doing some research, maybe looking at some information online, usually then making that first point of contact, and the first point of contact could be sending an email just as an inquiry. It could be a phone call just to talk about available options. I think what we like to do here and what I always like to offer is that consultation. So a 15-20 minute to kind of get to know if it's going to be a good fit. And I think consultations can be really helpful. When I'm doing a consultation, I like to just remind people that it's pretty casual, informal conversation. And I encourage them to kind of think about it as like an interview. What is my background? What sort of experience do I have? Giving clients the opportunity to ask questions about that to ensure that it's something that's going to meet their needs and not to be afraid to ask those questions, because it ultimately is empowering clients to take the agency over their care by asking the questions to determine what it is that they're going to need.
I've been thinking about this kind of from the context of women in the middle of life. That's fascinating to me to watch the differences from generations of women. If you have a friend that you trust, that you know that they see a therapist and they have positive things to say about that, ask them about it. I feel like a personal reference is gold. Brittany, what do you think people should expect when they first start to reach out? I do think that over the course of the past couple of years, there have been some changes to the system that have made this a little bit easier for people to access. So it's not as like, oh my gosh, we've got 100 people looking for therapy for every one therapist, which honestly, for a while it kind of was. And it was a rough place for us to be as professionals because we want to be able to help people. But I think over the past couple of years, like normalizing virtual therapy is one thing. I think a lot of people walk into this process trying to get therapy and they feel disappointed either by their insurance doesn't cover as much as they thought it would, or there's some limitations. That's one of the reasons why I do feel strongly about us doing like consultations and spending that time working with people on that front end, because I've been in that situation myself with like looking for providers, I think, and you just kind of feel like it's such a gauntlet that you kind of stop looking.
Availability has been a barrier just with like lack of resources or limited resources, but I think that that's getting better.
Our industry honestly had to wake up a little bit and like how it offered care to people. I think it had to be a little bit more creative. I think as an art therapist, you're probably used to that. It helped us as a field evolve a lot. I think that's a positive thing. Any thoughts, Brittany, that you would kind of put out there on the importance of self-care for mental health, what that looks like for you, any experiences that you would like to share that have been meaningful for you that you think might be useful for others?
I want to start with saying self-care is not selfish. Self-care is so important. How we take care of ourselves reflects with everything in our lives. I think that, there's maybe a bit of misconception around self-care as well, that self-care is easy. That self-care just kind of happens.
Right.
Or even
be
wellness.
Purchased as well.
Yeah, self-care can help you feel good. And sometimes the things that we have to do for our self-care can be really hard, uncomfortable things. Boundaries as a form of self-care sometimes leads us to having some pretty uncomfortable conversations.
Definitely.
But those uncomfortable conversations are sometimes the best things that we need to have for ourselves to support our self-care. And so I think, self-care is really an active process, and it does push us maybe to do things that can be uncomfortable, knowing that in the long run, they benefit us.
Yeah.
There can be small things that you do every day. There can be, maybe much larger things, that you can do. And some of those things are, mental and emotional boundaries. Some of the things are just active actions that we can take, like, going to bed every night at a decent time and waking up, at a regular hour and kind of having this like routine. And so I do think that there's like a spectrum of what self-care looks like. Yeah. For me personally, like self-care is really routine oriented. I'm a very routine person. And I think routine is helpful, and to a certain extent, like to not be super rigid with routine, but it's helpful for me to kind of know what to expect, right? Like I have my morning routine, I'm waking up, around the same time. I'm usually drinking a cup of tea in the morning. I'm doing maybe some yoga or some intentional movement, or maybe I'm working out, I'm going for a walk or something. Another really big thing that I'm huge with is like doing things for my future self as a way to take care of myself. Future me is going to be really happy.
Future me is going to be stoked.
Future me is going to be really happy if I fill up the water pitcher, at the end of the night. So then tomorrow morning or tomorrow during the day, there's cold water in the fridge. Yeah. Sometimes that little small moments actually help improve me taking care of myself the next day. And I can't stress that enough. It's about like what works for you. Yeah, absolutely. And I, sometimes you want to look at what other people are doing. You kind of want to compare yourself. For me, I kind of had to kind of step out of that and remind myself, I got to find what feels good for me.
One question that I have for you that I'm just curious about, this idea of being women in a certain era of life. Do you look at self-care differently now at the age that you are versus like when you were in your 20s? What's different there? What's changed?
I think that when I was younger, self-care wasn't as important to me. I think my self-care then was maybe what you were speaking to earlier about, like this thing that I could purchase.
Yes.
And it wasn't so much connecting now on like this mental, emotional, and spiritual level.
Like a more meaningful level, right?
Like this is way more intentional as I've gotten older and like have learned more about myself and like gone through this journey called life. I think it has definitely changed, and I am not afraid to put myself first. There are things about my life, are going to look different for other people's lives, and that's okay.
I think a lot of people would relate to what you said about the self-care being either passive or some commodity that you can either buy or add to your plate of things to do, right? And I very much think you're so on course when you talk about people kind of looking over their shoulders at oh, look what that other person can do, and you don't see their backstage and all of the things that they've had to go through. It's a really slippery slope to go down that comparison space. And I find that is a very, very big point of difficulty for many of the women that we see. Yeah. Absolutely. Feeling they go on social media and it's about 30 seconds in before they feel like they're just failing at life. Mm-hmm. That is a really toxic space. I think a lot about the content that I allow myself to be around. I'm personally not super great with routines. I tend to be, as we talked about earlier, I'm an air sign. And so sometimes routine can bore me a bit. Ultimately, future me knows it's a good thing. But at the same time, I also like a lot of spontaneity and it's falls into my self-care, either routine or just needs right now is intellectual stimulation. But I think a lot about things that I want to learn about and study. We talked about this, that there's just so much to learn in the world. And I also really like to learn about things that aren't therapy and psychology related, like fashion. I like to go see art. I like to see beautiful scenes. And I notice that when my self-care is not good, I'm neglecting those things. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of looking at things in this more utilitarian way. And I'm putting those things way back. And then I find also kind of going back to this idea of identity that I talked about a little bit more, that self-care, when it's really works well for you, when it becomes I can't flex on this, I can't compromise on this, I think it starts to support areas of our identity. And it's this is part of who I am. I am hearing more and more women in middle life opening up to this idea of, I don't know what else I would do. And then once they get more comfortable looking at what they've actually were interested in, what made you passionate, now you get to choose how you use that skill or that interest or how you want to explore it. And I think that that's something that I always feel really happy when I hear my clients talk about getting closer to that. And not having it necessarily be something that they need for survival. It's more about building up an intentional life. Thank you so much, Brittany, for chatting with me today. So it was really nice to be able to kind of hear more of your perspective about these things and the gifts that you share with our clients that I'm so grateful for. So thanks again for doing this.
Of course. Thank you, Kristin. It's such an honor to be here. It's certainly my pleasure to share all of these insights, do something for future you. Whatever that looks like, and find what feels good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. We invite you to hit subscribe and to keep coming back each week for a new empowering conversation. We look forward to seeing you at our website, where you'll find our newsletter, event dates, and other amazing resources. Visit interwoven.com, that's interwovxn.com, to sign up today. This show's copyright is January of 2023. We want to thank In Context Inc., digital marketing agency, and the Sugar Maple Bar for their support this season, as well as our producers, Teresa Kopak, Rebecca Jankowski, and Jen Gilmore. All original music was created and performed by Janet Ransdell and Susie Muehlbauer.